In the shadows of Little Italy, a man earned his place in the underworld with nothing but loyalty and a left-handed dice roll. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero spent 26 years building a reputation in the Bonanno crime family, only to have everything shattered by the one person he trusted most. This is the true story of a mobster who taught the FBI everything they needed to know about La Cosa Nostra without ever knowing he was the teacher. Before we dive into Lefty's incredible journey, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. And if you love true crime stories that help you drift off, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Give this video a like if you're ready for one of the most fascinating mob stories ever told. His story is one of contradictions. A man who carried 2 guns but preferred not to use them. A soldier who waited decades for recognition that never came. A mentor whose greatest student was his greatest betrayal. Tonight we're going to explore the life of Lefty Ruggiero. From his birth in the tenements of Hell's Kitchen to his quiet death in a Little Italy apartment, chain-smoking English ovals until his final breath. This isn't just a story about organized crime. It's about the American dream turned inside out. About loyalty in a world built on betrayal. About a man who played by all the rules and still lost everything. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back to a time when the streets of New York were ruled by men who spoke in whispers and settled disputes with violence. April 19th, 1926. The world was a different place. Calvin Coolidge was president. The roaring 20s were in full swing. Prohibition had turned ordinary men into millionaires and transformed American cities into battlegrounds for control of illegal alcohol. And in a cramped tenement in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan, a baby boy took his first breath. His parents, Fiore and Francesca Ruggiero, named him Benjamin. Hell's Kitchen in those days was exactly what its name suggested, a neighborhood of desperate poverty, overcrowded tenements, and simmering violence. It stretched from roughly 34th to 59th Street. Between 8th Avenue and the Hudson River, the Irish dominated the territory back then. But Italian immigrants were beginning to carve out their own spaces, their own power structures. Fiore Ruggiero worked as a truck driver, one of the few honest jobs that paid enough to keep a family fed in those desperate times. It was grueling work, starting before dawn and ending after sunset. His hands permanently colids, his back perpetually aching. Francesca kept house, stretching every penny, making meals from almost nothing, keeping their small apartment as clean and respectable as possible in a building where rats outnumbered residents. Young Benjamin grew up watching his father leave before sunrise and return exhausted after dark. He saw the toll that honest work took on a man. He saw how little reward came from following the rules, from breaking your back for someone else's profit. And he saw something else, too. Something that will shape the course of his entire life. He saw the wise guys. They walked the streets of Hell's Kitchen like they owned them. And in many ways, they did. While Fiore Ruggiero broke his back for a few dollars a day, these men wore expensive suits and carried thick rolls of cash. They were respected. They were feared. When they walked into a restaurant, the owner personally attended to them. When they needed something, people jumped to provide it. They had power. Real power. In a world where most men had none. The Ruggiero family eventually moved to Knickerbocker Village, a private housing development in Little Italy. It was considered a step up, a better neighborhood, safer streets. The buildings were newer, built in the early 1930s as part of a slum clearance project. But even in this improved environment, young Benjamin couldn't escape the pull of the streets. Little Italy was mob territory through and through. The neighborhood belonged to the 5 families that controlled New York's underworld. The Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, and the Lucchese family. These weren't street gangs. They were sophisticated criminal organizations with hierarchies, rules, and codes of conduct that had been refined over centuries. Benjamin was a teenager when he made the decision that would define his life. He was going to become a wise guy. He was going to join the Bonanno crime family. The Bonanno family had been founded by Joseph "Joe" Bananas Bonanno back in 1931 during the restructuring of the New York mob. They controlled territories in Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. They ran gambling operations, loan sharking rings, protection rackets, and later narcotics trafficking. They were one of the smallest of the 5 families, but they were fierce, proud, and loyal to their own. For a young man from Hell's Kitchen with limited prospects, the mob offered everything society denied him: respect, money, power, belonging, a chance to be somebody instead of nobody. But joining the mob wasn't like getting a regular job. You couldn't just walk up and apply. You had to be noticed. You had to prove yourself. And most importantly, you had to be sponsored by someone already in the family. Benjamin started hanging around the social clubs. The storefront headquarters where made men conducted business. He ran errands. He kept his mouth shut. He showed respect. He demonstrated the qualities the mob valued: loyalty, discretion, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. Slowly, gradually, he became part of the landscape. The made men begged to recognize him, to nod when he passed, to occasionally use him for small tasks. He was building a reputation, one small action at a time. This was the world Benjamin Ruggiero chose. Not the world of his father breaking his back for an honest wage, but the world of the wise guys, where respect came from fear and money came from taking what you wanted. He was young, ambitious, and naive about what lay ahead. He had no way of knowing that he was signing up for a life of frustration, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. He had no way of knowing that he would spend 26 years as a soldier, never advancing, never receiving the recognition he craved. He had no way of knowing that his greatest friendship would be his greatest betrayal. But that was all in the future. In the late 1940s, Benjamin Ruggiero was just a young man with a dream, trying to make his way in a world that respected only power and punished weakness without mercy. By the time Benjamin Ruggiero reached his 20s, he had become exactly what he wanted to be: a street soldier in the Bonanno crime family. He worked under Capo Michael Sabella, a made man who ran a crew handling various criminal enterprises across lower Manhattan and Brooklyn. The life of a street soldier was far less glamorous than the movies would have you believe. There were no mansions, no fleets of luxury cars, no beautiful women throwing themselves at you. For most soldiers, the mob was simply a job, and often not a particularly lucrative one. Benjamin's days were filled with mundane, repetitive work of organized crime. He ran bookmaking operations, taking bets on horse races, baseball games, boxing matches, anything people wanted to gamble on. He collected loans for the family's loan sharking operations, tracking down debtors who thought they could skip payments, explaining in vivid terms what would happen if they didn't pay up. He participated in extortion schemes, convincing business owners that they needed protection, conveniently forgetting to mention that the protection was from the very people offering it. It was during these years that Benjamin acquired the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Lefty. The name came from his habit of rolling dice with his left hand during craps games. In a world where everyone rolled right-handed, his southpaw style became his signature. Other gamblers would see that left hand reach for the dice and know immediately who was at the table: Lefty Ruggiero. The name stuck, became synonymous with the man himself, until hardly anyone remembered to call him Benjamin anymore. Later, he would earn a second nickname, one that spoke to a different aspect of his character: Lefty. Two Guns. The name came from his preference for carrying two weapons when he went on hits for the family. While other soldiers might carry a single pistol, Lefty believed in redundancy. If one gun jammed or ran out of bullets, he had a backup. It was practical, professional, the mark of a man who took his work seriously. But despite the tough nicknames and the reputation he was building, Lefty's life was characterized by constant financial pressure. The problem with being a street soldier in the mob was that you had to earn continuously. There was no salary, no steady paycheck. You earned from your operations, but a large percentage went up the chain. Your capo took his cut. The administration took their cut. By the time the money filtered down to you, there often wasn't much left. And Lefty had another problem. He was a degenerate gambler. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him. Here was a man who ran bookmaking operations, who understood the mathematical certainty that the house always wins. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from betting on horses, cards, dice, sports, anything with odds attached. He would win sometimes. Of course, everyone wins sometimes. But over time, inevitably, the losses mounted. The debts accumulated. The pressure to earn more intensified. This created a vicious cycle that would plague Lefty for his entire criminal career. He needed money to pay his gambling debts. To get money, he had to earn through criminal activities. But the stress of those activities made him want to gamble more. And so the wheel turned endlessly, grinding him down year after year. Through it all, Lefty maintained one constant habit that would eventually kill him: chain-smoking English Oval cigarettes. From the moment he woke up until the moment he went to sleep, there was almost always a cigarette between his lips. The English Ovals were his brand, distinguished by their oval shape and rich tobacco blend. He smoked them one after another, filling every room he entered with a blue-gray haze, staining his fingers yellow, slowly destroying his cells by cells. But cigarettes were the least of the dangers in Lefty's profession. The real risks came from the violence inherent in organized crime. Lefty participated in his share of hits over the years. The mob didn't kill casually or randomly. Every murder had a purpose, sent a message, solved the problem. Someone stole from the family. Someone was talking to law enforcement. Someone showed disrespect to a made man. Someone was muscling in on family territory. These weren't crimes of passion. They were business decisions executed with cold professionalism. We don't know exactly how many hits Lefty participated in over his career. The mob didn't keep records, and survivors didn't talk. But we know he was involved in enough violent acts to earn his nicknames and his reputation. He was reliable, discreet, and professional. When given a job, he completed it. Despite his criminal activities, Lefty managed to avoid serious legal consequences for most of his career. He was arrested multiple times over the years, like most active criminals, but remarkably, until 1981, he never served significant prison time. He was smart, careful, and lucky. He knew how to keep his mouth shut when arrested. He understood that a few hours in a holding cell was just part of doing business. The family would arrange for a lawyer. He would be released. Life would continue. But the constant stress, the violence, the gambling, the arrests, all of it took a toll on Lefty's personal life. His family relationships deteriorated. His marriage struggled under the weight of his criminal lifestyle and financial problems. One of his brothers even changed his surname from Ruggiero to Ruggiero, trying to distance himself from the notorious mobster in the family. In the legitimate world, the Ruggiero name had become a liability, a mark of shame rather than pride. Lefty's home life reflected his position in the mob hierarchy. He lived in a modest apartment in Little Italy. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. Made men lived in comfortable homes in the suburbs. Captains lived in mansions. But soldiers, even long-serving soldiers, like Lefty, lived modest lives. His apartment was small, sparsely furnished, functional rather than comfortable. It was a place to sleep, to eat quick meals, to smoke cigarettes while staring at walls and wondering when his luck would change. Because that's what ailed Lefty more than anything else, more than the financial struggles, more than the failing relationships, more than the constant threat of arrest or violence. It was the fact that after years of loyal service, after doing everything the family asked of him, after proving himself again and again, he was still just a soldier. He wasn't made in La Cosa Nostra. There was a strict hierarchy. At the bottom were the associates, men who worked with the family but weren't official members. Above them were the soldiers, the maidmen who had been formally inducted into the family through the secret ceremony. Above the soldiers were the capoeggers, or captains, who ran crews of soldiers. Above them were the underboss and consigliere, the family's second in command and counselor. And at the top sat the boss, the don, who ruled the family with absolute authority. To be made was everything. It meant you were untouchable by other criminals. It meant you had a voice in family matters. It meant respect, real respect, not the grudging acknowledgement given to Osful associate. It meant you were part of something ancient and honored, a tradition stretching back centuries to Sicily. But getting made required specific qualifications. You had to be of Italian descent. And not just Italian, but specifically Sicilian in many families. You had to be sponsored by a made man who would vouch for you. You had to prove your worth through years of loyal service. And most critically, in most families, you had to commit a murder, proving you would kill for the family if ordered. Lefty had all these qualifications. He was Italian. He had sponsors. He had proven his loyalty year after year. He had participated in hits. By all rights, he should have been made years ago. But he wasn't. Year after year, he was passed over. Younger men, men with better connections or more lucrative operations, got made while Lefty remained a soldier. It was a source of deep, festering resentment, a wound that never healed. The irony was that Lefty embodied everything the mob claimed to value. He was loyal. He kept his mouth shut. He followed orders. He showed respect. He earned for the family. But none of it was enough. In the mob, like in the legitimate world, success often came down to who you knew rather than what you did. And so Lefty continued grinding away year after year, carrying out his duties, running his operations, smoking his cigarettes, gambling away his earnings, and waiting for recognition that never came. By the winter of 1976, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had been a loyal soldier of the Bonanno crime family for over 2 decades. He was 50 years old, chain-smoking, gambling, struggling financially, and frustrated by his lack of advancement. His best years were behind him. His health was beginning to fail. His family relationships were strained or broken. He was, by almost any measure, a man whose life had not lived up to its promise. But everything was about to change in the most unexpected, devastating way possible. Lefty Ruggiero was about to become one of the most important figures in the history of American organized crime. Not because of anything he did, but because of what was done to him. A federal agent named Joseph Peastone was about to walk into his life, and nothing would ever be the same. To understand what happened next, we need to understand just how long Lefty had been climbing the ladder and how little progress he had made. 26 years. That's how long Lefty served as a soldier in the Bonanno crime family. 26 years of loyalty, of taking orders, of earning money for men above him in the hierarchy. 26 years of risking arrest, prison, or death in service to the family. 26 years of waiting for his turn, for his recognition, for his chance to finally become a made man. To put that in perspective, 26 years is longer than many people's entire careers. It's a generation. Children are born, grow up, and start families of their own in that time. Lefty had spent more than a quarter century as a loyal soldier, and he was still exactly where he started. The frustration was compounded by watching younger men leapfrog past him. Men who had been on streets for only a few years would suddenly get their buttons, would be inducted into the family as made men, would gain all the privileges and protections that came with that status. Meanwhile, Lefty, with his decades of service, his proven reliability, his deep knowledge of family operations, remained stuck in place. Why? The reasons were complex and never fully explained to him. Part of it was simply bad luck, being in the wrong crew at the wrong time. Part of it was his gambling problem, which marked him as financially unreliable. Part of it was the lack of powerful sponsors advocating for him. Part of it was simply the arbitrary nature of mob politics, where advancement often depended more on personal relationships than merit. But whatever the reasons, the result was the same. Year after year, Lefty remained a soldier. And with each passing year, the dream of advancement became more distant, more unlikely. The constant earning pressure was another source of frustration. In the mob, you weren't just expected to earn for yourself. You were expected to kick up to your captain. Your captain kicked up to the administration. The underboss and consigliere kicked up to the boss. Money flowed up the hierarchy like water flowing downhill. And at each level, someone took their cut. For a soldier like Lefty, this meant that even when he had a good operation going, even when money was coming in, he only kept a fraction of it. The rest went to men above him, men who were already wealthier, who had better homes, nicer cars, more comfortable lives. It was a feudal system, and Lefty was a serf, forever working to enrich his lords. His gambling habit made everything worse. Every dollar he managed to keep found its way to a bookmaker, a card game, a craps table. He would win occasionally, feel that rush of hope and possibility, then inevitably lose it all and more. The cycle was endless, exhausting, inescapable. His arrest record tells the story of an active criminal who was either very skilled or very lucky. Multiple arrests for various charges over the years, but no serious convictions before 1981. He knew how to handle police interrogations. Say nothing, demand the lawyer, wait for the family to arrange bail. The few times charges stuck, they were minor, resulting in fines or probation rather than significant jail time. This was actually a source of pride for Lefty, in a world where most criminals eventually did serious prison time. He had managed to stay relatively free. He was careful, smart, and disciplined when it came to law enforcement. He understood that the police and prosecutors were always watching, always gathering evidence, always trying to flip informants. He knew which of his associates could be trusted and which might fold under pressure. He practiced operational security before that term even existed. But all his caution, all his skills, all his loyalty still hadn't earned him advancement. And that ailed him constantly. The toll on his family was severe. His wife struggled with the uncertainty, the financial instability, the constant fear that one day he wouldn't come home. His relationships with his children were strained by his absences, his criminal lifestyle, his inability to be the father they needed. His brother's decision to change his surname to Ruggiero was particularly painful. A public rejection, not just of Lefty, but of the entire Ruggiero family name. In the legitimate world, family names carried pride, represented heritage and tradition. In Lefty's world, the Ruggiero name had become something to escape from, a burden to shed. Lefty's living situation reflected his status. His apartment in Little Italy was modest by any standard. It wasn't the kind of place that impressed anyone. Small rooms, old furniture, walls yellowed by decades of cigarette smoke. It was functional, nothing more. He didn't entertain there. He didn't host parties. It was simply where he slept and stored his belongings. made men live differently. They had nice houses, often in the suburbs, where they could pretend to be legitimate businessmen. Their wives wore jewelry. Their children went to good schools. They had boats, vacation homes, investments. They had arrived. Lefty had none of that. After 26 years of criminal activity, of risk and violence and constant hustle, he lived like a man barely scraping by. The money he earned evaporated through gambling, through kicking up to his superiors, through the simple expenses of daily life. He was always one step away from financial disaster, always scrambling to make the next payment to cover the next debt. The winter of 1976 was particularly difficult. Lefty was 50 years old, an age when most men in legitimate careers were thinking about retirement, about enjoying the fruits of decades of labor. But Lefty had no retirement plan, no pension, no savings to fall back on. He was still hustling, still earning, still gambling, still smoking, still trapped in the same cycles that had defined his adult life. He was bitter, frustrated, and increasingly desperate. Desperate for recognition, desperate for the respect he felt he deserved, desperate for his life to finally mean something beyond being another anonymous soldier, carrying out someone else's orders. In that desperation, in that hunger for belonging and recognition, Lefty was vulnerable. He was vulnerable in a way he didn't recognize, couldn't protect against. He was vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation that the FBI was preparing to deploy against him. Because that winter, the FBI's organized crime unit was finalizing plans for an operation unlike anything they had attempted before. They were going top as an undercover agent deep inside a mafia family. Not as an informant, not as someone gathering information from the periphery, but as a full participant in mob life, someone who would be trusted, included, taught the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra. The operation was called Sunnable, though it would become known by another name, Operation Donnie Brasco. And the FBI agent selected for this incredibly dangerous assignment was Joseph Pistone, a man who would become the most successful undercover agent in FBI history. A man who would spend 6 years living a double life. A man who would become Lefty Ruggiero's best friend, protege, and ultimately his complete destruction. Lefty had no way of knowing any of this as winter settled over Little, Italy in 1976. He had no way of knowing that his entire world was about to be infiltrated, documented, and destroyed. He had no way of knowing that his desperate hunger for recognition and belonging was about to be exploited in the most devastating way possible. He was just a 50-year-old soldier, smoking his English ovals, placing his bets, running his operations, and dreaming of the day he would finally be made. Finally be somebody. Finally be respected. That day would never come. But something else was coming. Something that would make him infamous rather than famous. Studied rather than celebrated. A cautionary tale rather than a success story. Joseph Pistone was coming. And when he arrived, nothing in Lefty's world would ever be the same again. The year 1976 was a pivotal moment in the FBI's war against organized crime. For decades, federal law enforcement had struggled to penetrate the inner workings of the American Mafia. The mob's code, the sacred oath of silence, made it nearly impossible to flip members into informants. Traditional surveillance techniques yielded limited results. Wiretaps captured fragments of conversations. But mobsters spoke in code and conducted important business face-to-face, where no electronic surveillance could reach. The FBI needed something different, something bold. They needed to put someone inside. The Bureau had attempted undercover operations before, with mixed results. The problem was that Mafia members were extraordinarily suspicious of outsiders. It took years to build trust. Any small mistake, any inconsistency in your cover story, any unusual behavior could mark you as law enforcement and get you killed. Previous undercover attempts had achieved some success around the periphery of mob operations. But no one had successfully penetrated deep into a family's inner circle. That was about to change. In the FBI's New York office, supervisors selected Special Agent Joseph Dominic Peastone for an experimental deep cover operation targeting the Bonanno crime family. Peastone was ideal for the assignment. He was Italian-American, grew up in an Italian neighborhood, spoke the language, understood the culture. He was in his mid-30s, young enough to be believable as a low-level criminal, old enough to be taken seriously. He was cool under pressure, quick thinking, and possessed an actor's ability to inhabit a role completely. The operation was coded Sunup, a bureaucratic designation. It would soon be forgotten in favor of the cover identity Peastone created Donnie Brasco. The fictional Donnie Brasco was a small-time jewel thief from Vero Beach, Florida. The cover was carefully constructed to be believable and checkable. Brasco had supposedly done small jobs, moved around a lot, never stayed in one place long enough to attract serious law enforcement attention. He was a hustler, always looking for the next score, willing to work with anyone who could help him make money. To make the cover convincing, the FBI invested heavily in Peastone's training. He took extensive gemology courses, learning to identify diamonds, evaluate quality, understand the wholesale jewelry market. This knowledge would be crucial. In the mob world, everyone claimed to have connections, to be able to get merchandise, to know people. But if you claimed to be a jewel thief and couldn't tell a cubic zirconia from a diamond, you were either a liar or law enforcement, probably both. Peastone also studied mob culture obsessively. He read everything available about La Cosa Nostra's history, structure, and traditions. He learned the vocabulary, the etiquette, the unspoken rules that govern every interaction. He understood that the mob wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a complete society with its own language, customs, and codes of honor. To infiltrate it, he had to become fluent in that culture. The first phase of the operation focused on establishing Donnie Brasco's presence in mob circles. Peastone began frequenting bars and social clubs where mobsters gathered. He made small talk, bought drinks, let himself be known as a guy who was around. He didn't push, didn't ask questions, didn't try too hard. He simply existed in these spaces, becoming familiar, becoming part of the landscape. This phase took months. You couldn't rush trust in the mob world. Rushing made you look desperate or suspicious. So Peastone took his time, let relationships develop naturally, waited for opportunities. The opportunity came in 1976 through a low-level Colombo family associate who introduced Peastone to various mobsters in Lower Manhattan. These introductions led to more introductions, to small deals, to opportunities to demonstrate that Donnie Brasco was a capable criminal who could be useful. And then, in a social club in Little Italy, Joseph Peastone met Benjamin Ruggiero. The initial meeting was unremarkable, the kind of interaction that happened hundreds of times a day in mob circles. Peastone was introduced by a mutual associate. Handshakes were exchanged. Small talk was made. They discussed the weather, sports nothing of consequence. It was simply two criminals being introduced in a social setting. But something clicked between them. Lefty, despite his decades in the mob, was a fundamentally lonely man. His family relationships were strained. His mob associates were exactly that, associates. People he worked with, but didn't trust with personal confidences. He had no real friends. No one he could relax around. No one who cared about him as a person, rather than as a useful criminal connection. Donnie Brasco, Joseph Peastone, playing Donnie Brasco, was charming, respectful, and genuinely interested in what Lefty had to say. He asked questions, but not too many questions. He showed respect for Lefty's experience and knowledge. He laughed at Lefty's jokes. He listened when Lefty talked. For Lefty, this was intoxicating. Here was a younger guy, smart, capable, who looked up to him, who wanted to learn from him. After decades of being overlooked and undervalued, suddenly someone was treating him like he mattered, like his experience and knowledge were worth something. For P-Stone, Lefty represented exactly what the FBI was hoping for: a way into the family. Lefty was a soldier with decades of experience. He knew how things worked. He had connections throughout the Bonanno family and relationships with other families. Most importantly, he was hungry for validation, for recognition, for someone to acknowledge his worth. That hunger made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation P-Stone was trained to deploy. Their early interactions were casual, just two guys getting to know each other. They would meet at social clubs, grab coffee, talk about sports and current events. P-Stone carefully maintained his cover, dropping details about fictional jewelry heists, mentioning connections in Florida, always staying consistent with Donnie Brasco's manufactured history. Gradually, Lefty began opening up. He talked about the mob life, about the rules and traditions, about the way things worked. He complained about being passed over for advancement, despite his loyal service. He shared his frustrations, his disappointments, his dreams of finally getting made. This was gold for the FBI. Every conversation was secretly recorded, or when recordings weren't possible, meticulously documented in P-Stone's reports. Lefty was inadvertently teaching the FBI about the Bonanno family structure, operations, and internal politics. He was revealing secrets that the Bureau had spent decades trying to uncover. But for P-Stone, something unexpected was happening. Despite himself, despite his training, despite knowing this was all a deception, he was beginning to genuinely like Lefty. The man was undeniably criminal, had undoubtedly participated in terrible acts. And yet there was something oddly sympathetic about him: his loyalty to an organization that didn't value him, his continued hope despite repeated disappointments, his loneliness and hunger for connection. This emotional complexity would haunt P-Stone for years after the operation ended. He was becoming friends with a man he was betraying. Real friends, or at least as real as friendship, could be when one party was living a complete lie. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Lefty began treating Donnie like a protege, teaching him the unwritten rules of mob life. How to dress properly, not flashy, but respectable, showing you had money without advertising it. How to talk, using the right phrases, showing respect in the right ways. How to walk with confidence, but not arrogance, like you belonged, but weren't trying to prove anything. Lefty taught Donnie about respect, the currency of the mob world. How you showed respect to made men, by standing when they entered, by offering them the seat of honor, by never contradicting them publicly. How you showed respect to your superiors, by kicking up money on time, by following orders without question, by never causing problems that reflected badly on them. He taught Donnie about the hierarchy, who answered to whom, who had power, and who merely pretended to have power. He explained the role soldiers, capos, underboss, consigliere, boss. He described the decision-making processes, how disputes were settled, how business was conducted. All of this was exactly what the FBI wanted. P-Stone was receiving a comprehensive education in La Cosa Nostra, directly from a veteran member. The intelligence he was gathering was unprecedented in its depth and detail. But beyond the intelligence value, something else was developing. Lefty was beginning to see Donnie as a surrogate son, a son he wished he had, the protege he had always wanted, someone who appreciated him and looked up to him. Their relationship was filling a void in Lefty's life, a need for connection and validation that had gone unmet for decades. P-Stone understood this and, following his training, exploited it ruthlessly. He praised Lefty's knowledge and experience. He sought Lefty's advice on everything. He made Lefty feel important, valued, respected. He gave Lefty what the mob had denied him for 26 years: recognition. and Lefty responded by pulling Donnie deeper into his world, sharing more secrets, making more introductions, vouching for Donnie's trustworthiness to other mobsters. He was, without knowing it, giving the FBI exactly what they needed to destroy the Bonanno crime family. As 1976 turned into 1977, the relationship between Lefty and Donnie was firmly established. They were more than associates. They were friends. Or at least Lefty believed they were. For Peastone, the line between his role and his genuine feelings was becoming increasingly blurred. He was living as Donnie Brasco more than as Joseph Peastone. His family life was suffering. His wife and daughter saw him rarely and briefly. He was immersed in the mob world almost completely, to the point where maintaining his real identity was becoming difficult. But the operation was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. The FBI was learning more about the Mafia's inner workings than they had in decades of investigation. And it was all because of a lonely, overlooked soldier named Lefty Ruggiero, who had finally found someone who made him feel valued. The tragedy was unfolding in slow motion. Lefty's desperate need for connection was destroying him. His willingness to trust, to open up, to share his knowledge was sealing his fate. The very qualities that made him sympathetic, his loyalty and his loneliness, were being weaponized against him. And he had no idea. He thought he had finally found a friend, a protege, someone who understood him. He had no idea that every word he spoke was being documented. Every secret he shared was being recorded. Every introduction he made was another nail in his coffin. The most successful undercover operation in FBI history was underway, and Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was its unwitting architect. In the mob world, vouching for someone is not a casual act. It's not like recommending a friend for a job or introducing someone at a party. When you vouch for someone in La Cosa Nostra, you are literally putting your life on the line. The principle is simple and terrifying. If the person you vouch for turns out to be a rat, an informant, or law enforcement, you pay the ultimate price. Your life is forfeit. No excuses. No second chances. No explanations will save you. You vouched. You were wrong. You die. Lefty understood this completely. He had lived in the mob world for over 2 decades. He had seen men killed for far less serious mistakes than vouching for a federal agent. He knew the rules, knew the stakes, knew the consequences. And yet, in 1977, he made the decision that would ultimately destroy him. He vouched for Donnie Brasco. If he's wrong, I'm gone, Lefty told other mobsters when introducing Donnie. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't hyperbole. It was a literal statement of fact. If Donnie Brasco turned out to be anything other than what he claimed to be, Benjamin Ruggiero would be murdered by his own crime family. Why would Lefty take such an enormous risk? Several factors converged. First, he genuinely believed Donnie was legitimate. Peastone's cover was excellent. His knowledge of jewelry and criminal operations was convincing, and his behavior was consistent with a small-time criminal looking to expand his opportunities. Lefty had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Second, Lefty saw opportunity. Donnie had connections to jewelry theft operations and potential scores that could be lucrative. If Lefty brought someone valuable into the family, someone who could earn, it might finally get him the recognition he craved. It might be his ticket to getting made. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Lefty genuinely cared about Donnie. This wasn't just business. This was personal. Donnie had become the closest thing Lefty had to a real friend. In vouching for him, Lefty was not just pursuing opportunities. He was validating their relationship, declaring to the world that this young man was worthy, was trustworthy, was part of their world. The vouching process involved introducing Donnie deeper and deeper into the Bonanno family's operations. Lefty brought him to meetings with made men. He included him in criminal schemes. He shared information that was supposed to be restricted to family members. He was step-by-step integrating Donnie Brasco into the fabric of the Bonanno crime family. For the FBI, this was a dream scenario. Piston was gaining access to operations and individuals that would have been impossible to reach through our traditional investigative methods. Every introduction Lefty made opened new doors, revealed new secrets, provided new intelligence. The operation expanded beyond New York. In the late 1970s, Lefty and Dominic "Sonny" Black Napolitano, another Bonanno soldier, were running operations in Tampa, Florida. Sonny Black was ambitious, charismatic, and ruthless. He saw opportunities in Florida's expanding cocaine trade and was building connections with traffickers and dealers. Lefty brought Donnie into these Florida operations. They worked out of the King's Court Bottle Club in Tampa, a legitimate-seeming establishment that served as a front for illegal gambling, stolen property fencing, and drug deals. Donnie participated in all of it, documented all of it, and the FBI's case against the Bonanno family grew stronger with each passing month. The depth of Lefty's trust in Donnie was extraordinary, and in retrospect, tragic. He brought Donnie to his apartment multiple times, an intimate gesture in mob culture, where homes were private sanctuaries, not places where business was conducted. In that modest Little Italy apartment, with cigarette smoke filling the air, Lefty opened up completely. He shared his frustrations about never being made despite decades of service. He explained the internal politics of the family, who was allied with whom, who was moving up, who was falling out of favor. He taught Donnie the subtle arts of mob life, how to read situations, how to avoid stepping on toes, how to get things done without creating enemies. He shared his financial problems, his gambling debts, his constant struggle to make ends meet. He talked about his family, his strained relationships, his regrets. He was vulnerable in ways that would have been unthinkable with anyone else in his mob life. For Piston, these intimate moments were professionally valuable and personally devastating. Every confidence Lefty shared was evidence for the FBI's case. But they were also reminders that Lefty was a human being, flawed and tragic, whose life was being systematically dismantled by the man he trusted most. The criminal operations Donnie participated in grew increasingly serious. Lefty ordered him to carry out 4 separate hits for the family. These weren't idle threats or theoretical assignments. They were actual contracts on actual people whom the family wanted dead. This created an enormous problem for the FBI. They couldn't allow an undercover agent to commit murder, not even to maintain his cover. But if Donnie refused or failed to complete the hits, his cover would be blown, and he would likely be killed immediately. The solution was elaborate and risky. The FBI staged the hits. They identified the targets, arranged for them to disappear temporarily, and created evidence that the murders had been completed. False arrest records were created, showing the targets being taken into custody before they could be killed. Bodies were reported in ways that suggested the hits had been successful, even though the targets were actually in protective custody or relocated. It was an incredible deception, requiring coordination across multiple FBI offices and jurisdictions. One mistake, one person not following the script, and Piston would be exposed. But it worked. Lefty believed the hits had been completed. Donnie's reputation as a reliable soldier was enhanced. His integration into the family deepened. Throughout 1978 and 1979, the operation continued to expand. Piston wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore. He was actively participating in criminal enterprises, making cases not just against the Bonanno family, but against other families and criminal organizations they worked with. He documented gambling operations, loan sharking schemes, hijacking rings, and drug trafficking networks. He identified corrupt officials who were on the mob's payroll. He mapped out the Bonanno family's entire organizational structure. He recorded conversations that revealed how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, how money flowed through the organization. All of this was possible because Lefty had vouched for him. Every door that opened, every meeting Donnie attended, every secret he learned existed because Benjamin Ruggiero had staked his life on Donnie Brasco's legitimacy. The irony was painful. Lefty, who had spent 26 years trying to prove his worth to the Bonanno family, who had never received the recognition he deserved, was inadvertently destroying that family through his trust in a man who didn't exist. By 1980, Pistone had been undercover for 4 years. It was an extraordinarily long time to maintain a false identity. The psychological toll was immense. He was living almost entirely as Donnie Brasco, seeing his real family only occasionally. His marriage was strained to the breaking point. His children barely knew him. He was developing habits and speech patterns from his undercover life that were bleeding into his real identity. The FBI was becoming concerned. Deep cover operations weren't supposed to last this long. The risk of exposure increased with every day. The psychological damage to the agent increased with every day. There were discussions about when and how to end the operation. But the intelligence was so valuable, the access so unprecedented, that the decision was made to continue. Just a little longer. Just a few more months. There was always one more meeting to attend, one more conversation to record, one more piece of the puzzle to document. Lefty, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly dependent on his relationship with Donnie. His financial situation remained precarious. His standing in the family hadn't improved. Despite bringing Donnie in, he was still just a soldier, still overlooked, still struggling. But at least he had Donnie, someone who respected him, who valued his knowledge, who treated him like he mattered. Their relationship had evolved beyond mentor and student. They were partners now, working together on various schemes, watching each other's backs, splitting profits. Lefty trusted Donnie completely more than he trusted anyone else in his life. Donnie was family in a way that transcended the crime family structure. And that trust, that deep, genuine trust, was a lie. Everything was a lie. The friendship was a deception. Their respect was manufactured. The relationship existed solely to gather evidence that would be used to destroy Lefty's entire world. Pistone knew this. He lived with this knowledge every day. And despite his professional training, despite understanding that Lefty was a criminal who had participated in terrible acts, he felt the weight of what he was doing. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal. Years later, after everything had ended, Pistone would describe Lefty with a complex mixture of emotions: disgust at his crimes, sympathy for his suffering, regret at the necessity of the deception, respect for his loyalty, even when that loyalty was misplaced, and guilt. The persistent guilt of someone who knows they destroyed another person's life, even if it was for justified reasons. But in 1980, all of that was still in the future. The operation continued. Lefty continued vouching for Donnie, introducing him to more people, sharing more secrets, digging his own grave, one conversation at a time. The walls were closing in. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to bring down not just individuals, but the entire leadership structure of the Bonanno crime family. They had documented crimes involving dozens of made men and hundreds of associates. They had evidence of murders, drug trafficking, extortion, gambling, loan sharking, and countless other felonies. The only question was when to pull the plug, when to extract Pistone, arrest the targets, and reveal to the mob world that Donnie Brasco was FBI Special Agent Joseph Pistone. That revelation would shock organized crime like nothing before or since. It would lead to dozens of arrests, multiple murders, and a fundamental shift in how the FBI pursued organized crime investigations. and it would absolutely destroy Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. By 1980, Lefty and Donnie's relationship had evolved into something remarkable and tragic. What had started as a mob associate teaching a younger criminal the ropes had become a genuine mentorship, a transfer of knowledge and culture from one generation to the next. Lefty had essentially adopted Donnie as his protege, teaching him everything he knew about mob life. Not just the practical skills of criminal operations, but the deeper cultural knowledge that defined La Cosa Nostra, the traditions, the etiquette, the unwritten rules that govern every aspect of mob society. He taught Donnie how to dress like a wise guy, not flashy, that drew too much attention, but not shabby either. That showed disrespect. You wore good suits, well-tailored and conservative colors. You wore quality shoes, always shined. You wore minimal jewelry, maybe a nice watch, a simple ring. You looked prosperous, but not ostentatious, successful, but not vulgar. He taught him how to move through the world with confidence. Walk with purpose, but don't swagger. Make eye contact, but don't stare. Speak clearly, but don't dominate tech conversions. The goal was to project power without appearing to try. To command respect through presence rather than intimidation. He taught him the elaborate rituals of respect that permeated mob culture. How to greet a made man with genuine warmth but appropriate deference. How to show respect in public through gestures and positioning. How to show respect in private through generosity and loyalty. How to navigate the complex hierarchy without offending anyone. He taught him about earning, the fundamental activity that justified everything else. You had to earn continuously, always looking for opportunities, always working angles. But you also had to be smart about it. Don't draw attention. Don't step on other people's operations. Don't create problems for your superiors. He taught him about the importance of keeping your mouth shut. Omerta wasn't just a rule. It was the foundation of everything. You didn't talk to law enforcement, ever under any circumstances. You didn't gossip about family business. You didn't share details of operations with anyone outside the need-to-know circle. Silence was strength. Talking was death. He taught him about violence, when it was necessary and when it was counterproductive. The mob wasn't about random violence. It was about targeted, purposeful violence that sent messages and solved problems. You didn't kill someone because you were angry. You killed them because they violated fundamental rules or created unacceptable problems. And when you killed, you did it professionally, efficiently, without emotional trauma. But beyond these practical lessons, Lefty was also inadvertently teaching Donnie, and by extension, the FBI, about the human side of mob life, the camaraderie and the loneliness, the pride and the shame, the wealth and the poverty, the power and the vulnerability. He shared stories from his decades and the life jobs he had pulled, people he had known, times when everything went right and times when everything went wrong. These stories were entertaining, but they were also intelligence gold. Each anecdote revealed details about criminal operations, about family history, about relationships and rivalries that the FBI had never known existed. In those conversations, often conducted over coffee or meals, with cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, Lefty revealed himself completely. He talked about his disappointments, his 26 years of service without advancement. He talked about his financial struggles, his gambling debts, his constant pressure to earn more. He talked about his family problems, his strained relationships, his growing sense that his life hadn't turned out the way it should have. There was a deep sadness in Lefty that became more apparent the more time Donnie spent with him. Here was a man who had devoted his entire adult life to an organization that didn't value him, who had followed all the rules and received none of the rewards, who had sacrificed legitimate opportunities, family relationships, and personal happiness for a life that had given him very little in return. And yet, despite everything, despite the disappointments and frustrations, Lefty remained loyal. He still believed in the mob's code, still adhered to its rules, still dreamed that someday he would get his recognition. His loyalty wasn't pragmatic. It was almost religious, a faith that persisted despite all evidence that it was misplaced. This loyalty extended to his relationship with Donnie. He treated Donnie with genuine affection, not just as a business associate, but as someone he cared about personally. He worried when Donnie took risks. He celebrated when Donnie succeeded. He offered advice on everything from criminal operations to personal relationships. He shared his dream, a dream that had sustained him through decades of disappointment, becoming a made man. He talked about it constantly, what it would mean, how it would change his life, how it would finally validate everything he had sacrificed. He imagined the ceremony, the induction ritual that would transform him from a soldier into a full member of La Cosa Nostra. He fantasized about the respect he would command, the opportunities that would open up, the security and status that would finally be his. For Peastone, listening to these dreams was almost unbearable. He knew they would never come true. He knew that instead of becoming a made man, Lefty was heading toward arrest, imprisonment, or murder. Everything Lefty hoped for was about to be destroyed, and Peastone was the instrument of that destruction. But the operation continued. Peastone documented every conversation, detailed reports, gathered evidence. The case against the Bonanno family was becoming overwhelming. The FBI had enough evidence to indict dozens of members for hundreds of crimes. They had evidence of murders, conspiracy, racketeering, drug trafficking. They had organizational charts showing the family's complete structure. They had financial records showing money flowing through legitimate and illegitimate businesses. Most remarkably, they had insight into the culture and mentality of La Cosa Nostra that had never been attained before. Lefty had essentially provided a comprehensive course in mob life, teaching the FBI everything they needed to know about how the organization actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. This knowledge would prove invaluable beyond the immediate prosecutions. It would inform FBI strategy against organized crime for decades to come. It would be taught at the FBI Academy as the foundation for understanding mob culture. It would be used in countless subsequent investigations and operations. And aloft it came from Lefty's willingness to open up, to teach, to share his knowledge with someone he trusted. His generosity, his desire to pass on his accumulated wisdom, became the source of his destruction. The intimacy of their relationship created moral complexities that haunted Peastone. In some of their conversations, particularly late at night after long days, Lefty would become philosophical, reflective about his life and choices. He would talk about what he might have been if he had chosen differently, if he had pursued legitimate opportunities instead of the mob life. He would express regrets, not about specific crimes, but about paths not taken, potential unfulfilled. These moments humanized Lefty in ways that made Peastone's job harder. It's easier to betray a monster than to betray a flawed, sympathetic human being who trusts you. And Lefty, for all his criminal activity, was undeniably human lonely, disappointed, still hoping for something better, still believing that loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Peastone later wrote that Lefty was one of the most loyal people he had ever known. Not just loyal to the mob, but loyal to people he cared about. When he befriended someone, he was genuinely concerned about their welfare. When he vouched for someone, he meant it completely. His loyalty wasn't conditional or strategic. It was fundamental to his character. And that loyalty, that beautiful, tragic loyalty, was what made him vulnerable to the FBI's operation. A more cynical, suspicious mobster might have questioned Donnie's background more thoroughly, might have noticed inconsistencies, might have been more guarded. But Lefty wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that this young man respected him, learned from him, cared about him. He wanted to believe that his knowledge and experience mattered to someone. So he believed, and in believing, he sealed his fate. By early 1981, the FBI was preparing to end the operation. Peastone had been undercover for nearly 6 years, an unprecedented length of time. The psychological toll on Haim and his family was severe. His marriage was barely surviving. His children had grown up with an effectively absent father. He was having trouble maintaining the boundary between his undercover identity and his real self. But beyond the personal costs, there were practical considerations. The longer the operation continued, the greater the risk of exposure. And exposure meant not just the end of the operation, but potentially Peastone's death. If the mob discovered the truth before he could be extracted, he would be killed immediately. Plans were made. Extraction procedures were developed. Arrest warrants were prepared for dozens of targets. Prosecutors began organizing the evidence into coherent cases. The end was coming. Lefty had no idea. He continued his daily routine, running his operations, gambling away his earnings, chain-smoking his English ovals, and spending time with his good friend Donnie Brasco. He was still hoping that bringing Donnie into the family would finally earn him his button, would finally make him a maidman after all these years. He had no idea that every moment he spent with Donnie was being documented, that every secret he shared was being used to build a case against him and his family. He had no idea that the man he trusted more than anyone in the world was about to disappear, revealing himself as an FBI agent and leaving Lefty to face the consequences alone. The summer of 1981 was approaching, and with it, the end of everything Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had built over 26 years of mob life. July 26, 1981, a date that would forever divide Ruggiero's life into before and after. The FBI made the decision to end Operation Donnie Brasco. After nearly 6 years of deep cover infiltration, after gathering evidence of hundreds of crimes involving dozens of mobsters, after unprecedented access to the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra, it was time to pull the plug. The decision wasn't made lightly. The operation had been remarkably successful, providing intelligence and evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional means. But the risks were escalating. Peastone's psychological state was deteriorating. His family was falling apart. And most critically, there were signs that some mobsters were becoming suspicious. Not of Donnie Brasco specifically, but of the general situation. Too many operations were going wrong. Too many deals were falling through. Too much bad luck was happening around Donnie. In the paranoid world of organized crime, patterns like that eventually raised questions. The extraction had to be carefully planned. Peastone couldn't simply disappear. That would immediately mark him as either law enforcement or an informant, and the mob would hunt him forever. Instead, the FBI staged his disappearance as part of a fake contract killing, making it appear that Donnie Brasco had been murdered by rivals. This would give Peastone time to be removed from the undercover role. The FBI prepared for the arrests and revelations that would follow. On July 26th, Joseph Peastone surfaced from Heist's undercover identity for the last time. Donnie Brasco ceased to exist, and the FBI began executing arrest warrants and revealing to the world what had been accomplished. The revelation sent shockwaves through organized crime. The FBI called a press conference and announced that they had successfully placed an undercover agent deep inside the Bonanno crime family for 6 years. They revealed that Special Agent Joseph Peastone, using the identity of Donnie Brasco, had participated in mob operations, documented crimes, and gathered evidence leading to over 200 indictments. 200 indictments. The number was staggering. It included soldiers, capos, and even leadership figures. It covered crimes ranging from gambling and loan sharking to murder and drug trafficking. It represented the most successful infiltration of La Cosa Nostra in history. The mob was stunned. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Undercover agents had worked the periphery of mob operations, but no one had penetrated to the level Pistone had achieved. No one had been trusted with such intimate details of family operations. No one had been invited into the homes and lives of made men and soldiers. The implications were terrifying for the mob. If the FBI could do this once, they could do it again. Every new face was now suspect. Every associate who appeared after Pistone's exposure was potentially another undercover agent. The paranoia that always existed in mob culture intensified exponentially. But beyond the organizational implications, there were immediate, brutal consequences for specific individuals. The mob's code was absolute. Anyone who vouched for a rat was responsible. And several people had vouched for Donnie Brasco. Anthony Mira, a Bonanno soldier who had made the initial introduction that brought Pistone into contact with the family, was marked for death immediately. The family didn't care that he had been fooled by an expert FBI operation. He had brought law enforcement into the family, and for that, he would die. Dominic Sonny, Black Napolitano, who had worked closely with both Lefty and Donnie in the Florida operations, was also marked. He had vouched for Donnie, had trusted him, had included him in highly sensitive operations. His fate was sealed. And then there was Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, who had been Donnie's primary sponsor, mentor, and closest friend who had vouched for him repeatedly and enthusiastically, who had brought him deeper into the family than anyone, who had shared secrets and intimate details that should never have been revealed to anyone outside the inner circle. By all rights, by every rule of La Cosa Nostra, Lefty should have been killed immediately. The contract on his life should have been executed within hours of the FBI's revelation. But something unexpected happened. Before the mob could reach him, the FBI did. August 29, 1981, just over a month after the operation's revelation, FBI agents arrested Benjamin Ruggiero. The arrest wasn't just about prosecuting him for his crimes. It was also about saving his life. The FBI knew that Lefty was marked for death. The Bonanno family's leadership had issued contracts on everyone who had vouched for Donnie Brasco. Mira and Sonny Black were already being hunted. Lefty was next. By arresting him, by removing him from the streets, and placing him in federal custody, the FBI prevented the mob from reaching him. It was an ironic form of protection, saving a man by arresting him. When the FBI agents came for him, Lefty understood immediately what had happened. Donnie Brasco wasn't dead. Donnie Brasco had never existed. His closest friend, his protege, the man he had trusted completely and vouched for repeatedly, was FBI Special Agent Joseph Pistone. The realization must have been devastating. Everything he had believed about Donnie was a lie. Every conversation they had shared was an interrogation. Every moment of friendship was an act. For 6 years, Lefty had opened his life, his heart, his world to someone who was systematically documenting everything to use against him. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just professional. It was personal. Donnie had been family, and family doesn't betray family. Except this family member wasn't real. He was a construction, a character, a tool used to destroy everything Lefty had built over 26 years. In federal custody, Lefty faced an immediate decision. The FBI offered him a deal: cooperate, enter the witness protection program, testify against other mobsters, and in exchange, receive a reduced sentence and protection from mob retaliation. It was a reasonable offer. Lefty had been betrayed by the mob as much as he had been betrayed by Pistone. The family he had served loyally for decades was now trying to kill him. He owed them nothing. Cooperation would save his life, reduce his prison time, and give him a chance at some kind of future. Lefty refused. Absolutely. Completely. Without hesitation, he refused. He would not cooperate. He would not testify. He would not break omerta, the sacred code of silence that defined La Cosa Nostra. Even after everything that had happened, even knowing that the family wanted him dead, even facing significant prison time, Lefty remained loyal. His refusal to cooperate was remarkably consistent with everything about his character. Loyalty was fundamental to who he was. He had been loyal for 26 years when it earned him nothing. He remained loyal now when loyalty might literally cost him his life. The FBI agents conducting the interrogation were reportedly stunned. They had offered him an escape, a way out, and he had refused it. They couldn't understand why a man in his position would choose honor over survival. But they didn't understand the depth of Lefty's commitment to the mob's code. Omerta wasn't just a rule. It was an identity. To break it was to betray everything he believed in, everything he had sacrificed for. He had already lost everything, his reputation, his freedom, his friend. The only thing he had left was his honor, his adherence to the code. And he would not surrender that, not to save himself, not for any reason. Meanwhile, the mob was executing its own justice. On February 11th, 1982, Anthony Mira's body was discovered in the parking garage of a Manhattan office building. He had been shot multiple times. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who bring rats into the family, even unknowingly. Dominic Sonny, Black Napolitano's fate was even more brutal. On August 17, 1981, less than a month after the operation was revealed, he was called to a meeting with Bonanno family leadership. He knew what it meant. He knew he was being summoned to his own execution. Remarkably, he went anyway. He could have run, could have sought BI protection, could have tried to disappear. Instead, he put on his best suit, left his keys and wallet in a secure location where his girlfriend could find them, and went to the meeting. His body was never officially found, though the mob made sure everyone knew he was dead. Sonny Black's decision to face his execution rather than run or cooperate was considered honorable in mob circles. He had made a mistake by vouching for Donnie, but he faced the consequences with dignity. He kept omerta. He died according to the code. Lefty, sitting in federal custody, heard about these murders. He knew he should be dead too. He had vouched for Donnie more than anyone. He had brought him deeper into the family than anyone. By rights, his body should have been found in a parking garage or made to disappear forever. But something saved him. His refusal to cooperate with the FBI. When word reached the Bonanno family leadership that Lefty was in custody, but had refused to become an informant, had refused to break omerta, even when offered protection and reduced sentencing, their attitude toward him shifted. He had been fooled. Yes. He had been used. Yes. But he hadn't betrayed the family. He hadn't talked. He had kept the code. The decision was made. The contract on Lefty's life was canceled. He would not be killed. His loyalty in the face of betrayal had saved his life. This decision says something profound about mob culture. Lefty had inadvertently caused enormous damage to the Bonanno family. His trust in Pistone had led to over 200 indictments, decimated the family's operations, and exposed intimate details of their organization to law enforcement. But because he maintained omerta, because he refused to compound the damage by cooperating, he was allowed to live. Loyalty, even after catastrophic failure, still counted for something. But if Lefty thought this meant he was welcomed back, that he would be forgiven and allowed to resume his place in the family after serving his sentence, he was mistaken. The contract might have been canceled, but his reputation was destroyed. He was the man who had been fooled by the FBI, the man whose trust had wrecked the family. His name would forever be associated with the greatest disaster in Bonanno family history. He would live, but he would live in disgrace. November 1982, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero stood in federal court and listened as a judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison for racketeering conspiracy. 15 years for a man who was 56 years old. It might as well have been a life sentence. By the time he got out, if he survived that long, he would be an old man with no family, no prospects, no future. This was the first time in Lefty's criminal career that he faced significant prison time. Despite decades of illegal activity, despite numerous arrests, he had always managed to avoid serious consequences. His luck, skill, and caution had kept him relatively free. But now, at the end of his career, he was finally going to pay the price for his life of crime. Or rather, he was going to pay the price for trusting the wrong person. The irony was bitter. Lefty hadn't been caught through traditional law enforcement investigation. He hadn't made a mistake that led to his arrest. He had been betrayed by his closest friend, someone he had vouched for, taught, and cared about. His greatest strength, his loyalty, and his willingness to trust had become his fatal weakness. Federal prison was a harsh environment, especially for a man of Lefty's age and declining health. The violence, the tension, the degradation of being confined and controlled all took their toll. But perhaps worse than the physical hardships was the psychological weight of his situation. He had time now nothing but time to reflect on his life and choices. 26 years as a loyal soldier, 26 years of earning, of following orders, of adhering to the code, 26 years of hoping for advancement, for recognition, for his chance to be made. And what did he, Javetto, show for it? A prison cell, a destroyed reputation, a place in history as the man who was fooled by the FBI's greatest undercover agent. The recognition he had craved for so long came, but not in the way he had imagined. He was famous now, but as a cautionary tale, as an example of what not to do, as the patsy who had been played by Donnie Brasco. His name would be remembered, but with pity or scorn, never with respect. His health declined rapidly in prison. The decades of chain smoking were catching up with him. He developed lung cancer, a grim but predictable consequence of smoking English ovals from morning until night for most of his adult life. The cancer spread, as cancer does, finding new places in his body to destroy. Then came the testicular cancer diagnosis. His body, worn down by decades of stress, poor diet, chain smoking, and the general wear and tear of the criminal lifestyle, was breaking down. The prison medical facilities were basic at best. Treatment options were limited. He was slowly dying, and everyone, including Lefty himself, knew it. The prison years must have been lonely beyond imagination. His family relationships, already strained before his arrest, didn't survive his imprisonment. Visits were rare or non-existent. The brother who had changed his surname wanted nothing to do with him. His children had their own lives, their own problems, their own reasons to distance themselves from their infamous father. His mob associates, the men he had worked with for decades, didn't visit either. He was toxic, now associated with the FBI's greatest success against the mob. Visiting him would raise questions, create suspicion. Better to forget he existed, to let him serve his time alone and die alone. So Lefty sat in his cell, smoking when he could, coughing blood with increasing frequency, watching his body deteriorate, and thinking about his life. What did he think about during those long, quiet hours? Did he regret his choices? Wish he had pursued a legitimate life like his father? Did he think about Donnie? About their friendship? About whether any of it had been real? Did he wonder what he could have been if he had made different choices at critical moments? We don't know. Lefty never gave interviews from prison. He never wrote a memoir or shared his thoughts with journalists. He maintained his silence, keeping omerta, even when breaking it would have harmed no one but himself. Perhaps he thought about Joseph Pistone, the man behind Donnie Brasco. Pistone had entered the witness protection program with his family immediately after the operation ended. His real identity was publicly known now, but his location and daily life were kept secret. The mob had put out contracts on his life, substantial ones, that would remain in place forever. Pistone would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if today was the day they finally found him. Did Lefty take any satisfaction in that? Did it comfort him to know that the man who betrayed him was also suffering, also paying a price, also living a diminished life? Or did he simply feel empty, hollowed out by the enormity of the deception? The complexity of Lefty's situation was that he couldn't fully hate Donnie Brasco because Donnie Brasco had never existed. He had been betrayed by a fiction, fooled by a performance. Joseph Pistone was a stranger, someone Lefty had never actually known. The person he had trusted, cared about, and mentored was a construction, a lie given human form. How do you process that kind of betrayal? How do you reconcile genuine emotions with the knowledge that they were directed at someone who wasn't real? Pistone later wrote about Lefty with a mixture of emotions. He acknowledged Lefty's crimes and didn't excuse them. But he also expressed a kind of sympathy and understanding that Lefty was a tragic figure, a man whose loyalty exceeded his judgment, whose desperate need for belonging made him vulnerable to manipulation. In Pistone's account, their friendship wasn't entirely fake. The emotions were intentionally manufactured. Pistone genuinely came to respect certain aspects of Lefty's character, particularly his loyalty and his willingness to mentor others. The friendship was built on deception, yes, but some of the emotions were real, at least on Pistone's side. Whether this makes the betrayal better or worse is impossible to say. Is it more humane to genuinely care about someone you're betraying? Or is it more professional to feel nothing at all? These questions have no good answers. They exist in a moral gray area where duty, deception, and human emotion intersect in complicated ways. What we know for certain is that Lefty served his time without complaint, without cooperation, without breaking the code that had defined his life. The cancer spread, the pain increased, the future narrowed to a single certainty. He would die in prison or shortly after release. Another casualty of the mob life he had chosen decades earlier. The years passed slowly in federal prison. 1983, 1984, 1985. Each year blurred into the next, marked only by the gradual deterioration of his body and the slow, grinding passage of time. Other mobsters from Operation Donnie Brasco filtered through the system. Some took plea deals. Some fought their cases and lost. Some cooperated and entered witness protection. But most, like Lefty, served their time according to the code, keeping silent, refusing to add their voices to the FBI's growing knowledge of mob operations. The Bonanno crime family struggled to recover from the damage. Over 200 indictments had decimated the ranks. Leadership was in disarray. Operations were compromised. Other families viewed them with suspicion and contempt. They had been infiltrated, exposed, humiliated. It would take years to rebuild their reputation and operational capacity, and all of it traced back, directly or indirectly, to the man sitting in a federal prison cell, chain smoking when permitted, coughing blood, dying slowly from cancer. Lefty had to live with that knowledge. His trust, his mentorship, his friendship, it caused all of it. Hadn't intended to. He had been deceived. But the consequences were his responsibility nonetheless. The code said that when you vouched for someone, you accepted responsibility for them. He had vouched, and he would carry that responsibility to his grave. But through it all, through the prison years and the sickness and the loneliness, One fact remained that gave his life a shred of dignity. He had kept omerta. He had remained loyal. He had not betrayed the code. In the mob world, this mattered. It didn't excuse his mistakes. It didn't repair the damage he had inadvertently caused. But it meant something. It meant that despite everything, despite being fooled and betrayed and destroyed, Benjamin Ruggiero was still a man of honor by the mob's standards. That distinction, meaningless to the outside world, was everything to him. It was all he had left. April 1993, after serving almost 11 years of his 15-year sentence, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero walked out of federal prison, a free man, free, but broken. At 67 years old, after more than a decade in prison with cancer ravaging his body, Lefty emerged into a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. The New York he returned to wasn't the same city he had left. The mob's influence had waned significantly. The FBI's success with Operation Donnie Brasco had emboldened law enforcement and showed that La Cosa Nostra wasn't invulnerable. RICO statutes were being used aggressively to prosecute entire criminal organizations rather than individual criminals. Surveillance technology had improved. Informants were more common, as mobsters increasingly chose cooperation over lengthy prison sentences. The world Lefty had known, the world where made men walk the streets with impunity and mob, power seemed eternal, was fading. Not gone, but diminished, transformed into something smaller and more desperate. Lefty returned to Little Italy, a neighborhood that had shaped him, that had been the center of his world for most of his life. But even Little Italy was changing. Gentrification was beginning. Young professionals were moving in. Rents were rising. The old social clubs where mobsters had gathered were closing or being repurposed. The neighborhood was becoming a tourist destination, a sanitized version of its former self. He moved into a modest apartment, similar to the one he had lived in before his arrest. There was nowhere else to go. His family ties were severed or severely damaged. His mob associates kept their distance. He was officially retired from criminal life. Not that he could have resumed it even if he wanted to. He was too sick, too old, too infamous. His daily routine was simple and sad. He woke up, he smoked cigarettes. He coughed. He watched television. He ate modest meals. He smoked more cigarettes. He went to bed. He repeated this cycle day after day. His world shrank to the confines of a small apartment and the few blocks he could walk without exhausting himself. The cancer that had been diagnosed in prison continued its inexorable progression. The lung cancer was expected, a predictable consequence of decades of chain smoking. But the testicular cancer added another layer of suffering, another reminder that his body was systematically failing. He received basic medical treatment, but at his age and with his history, aggressive intervention wasn't an option. The cancer was terminal. It was only a question of when, not if. Did he reflect on his life during those final months? Did he find any peace or acceptance? Did he wish he had made different choices, lived a different life? We don't know. Lefty remained silent about his inner thoughts until the end. What we do know is that he continued smoking English ovals until he physically couldn't anymore. The cigarettes that had been his constant companion for over 50 years stayed with him to the end, a symbol of habits that define us and destroy us. He didn't seek publicity. He didn't give interviews. He didn't try to profit from his notoriety by writing a book or selling his story. He simply existed quietly in that Little Italy apartment, waiting for the end. The end came on November 24th. 1994. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero died from complications of lung and testicular cancer. He was 68 years old. His death was not front-page news. It was noted briefly in newspapers, A short obituary for a man who had once been at the center of the FBI's most successful undercover operation. But the world had moved on. New crimes, new criminals. New stories captured attention. Lefty's death was simply the final punctuation story that had concluded years earlier. His funeral was modest, attended by a small group of people. Some family members came, though relationships remained strained. A few old associates paid their respects, though carefully, aware that being associated with Lefty, even in death, carried implications. There was no elaborate ceremony, no speeches celebrating his life, no recognition of his decades of loyalty to the Bonanno family. He was buried quietly, without fanfare. Another casualty of the mob life. In death, as in life, Lefty received little recognition for his service. The family he had served for 26 years didn't claim him as one of their honored dead. They couldn't really. His name was too associated with disaster, with the FBI's greatest triumph. It was better to forget him, to let him fade into history. And yet, Lefty's story didn't end with his death. In fact, in many ways, his story was just beginning to reach a much wider audience. 3 years after Lefty's death, in 1997, Columbia Pictures released Donnie Brasco, a feature film depicting the FBI's undercover operation. Al Pacino portrayed Benjamin Ruggiero. Johnny Depp played Joseph Peastone. The film was a critical and commercial success, introducing Lefty's story to millions of people worldwide. Pacino's portrayal captured something essential about Lefty: the loyalty, the loneliness, the desperate hunger for recognition. The film didn't glorify mob life. Instead, it showed the grinding, unglamorous reality of it, particularly for soldiers like Lefty, who did all the work and received little reward. The movie's most poignant moments involved the relationship between Lefty and Donnie, showing genuine affection and mentorship existing alongside deception and betrayal. It captured the moral complexity of the situation, a criminal who participated in terrible acts, but was also, in his way, a victim of manipulation and betrayal. For the first time, mainstream audiences could understand Lefty not just as a criminal statistic, but as a human being flawed, certainly guilty of serious crimes. Absolutely. But also tragic, sympathetic, and ultimately destroyed by the very qualities that should have been virtuous loyalty and trust. The film ensured that Lefty's name would be remembered, though whether he would have appreciated this fame is questionable. He had wanted recognition within the mob world, respect from his peers, acknowledgement of his service and loyalty. Instead, he became famous as a cautionary tale, as the man who was fooled as the patsy in the FBI's greatest success. His family's relationship with his legacy remained complicated. His granddaughter, Ramona Ruggiero, later appeared on VH1's reality show, Mob Wives, representing the Bonanno family and dealing with the complicated inheritance of being related to Lefty Ruggiero. She had to navigate the dual reality of loving her grandfather while acknowledging his criminal life and the disaster his trust caused. For the FBI, Lefty's contribution, though unwitting, was invaluable. Everything he taught Peastone about mob culture, operations, and mentality became foundational knowledge for law enforcement's understanding of organized crime. His openness, his willingness to share his accumulated wisdom with someone he trusted, gave the FBI insights they could never have obtained through conventional investigation. The FBI Academy still teaches Operation Donnie Brasco as a case study in successful undercover work. Peastone's methods, his patience, his ability to build genuine rapport while maintaining operational security became a model for subsequent undercover operations. And at the heart of that success was Lefty's decision to trust him, to vouch for him, to bring him into the family's inner circle. In a strange way, Lefty taught the FBI everything they needed to know to fight the mob. His lessons weren't intended for that purpose, of course. He thought he was teaching a protege, how to be a successful mobster. Instead, he was teaching the FBI how successful mobsters actually think and operate. This knowledge had lasting impact. The FBI USED, what they learned from Lefty to develop better strategies for investigating organized crime. They understood the culture better, could anticipate reactions more accurately, knew which pressures would be most effective in flipping informants. Operation Donnie Brasco marked a turning point in the war against the American Mafia, and much of that success traced back to Lefty's unwitting cooperation. Joseph Pistone, the man who destroyed Lefty's world, lived in anonymity under the Witness Protection Program. He eventually wrote books about his undercover experiences, describing Lefty in complex terms that acknowledged both his criminality and his humanity. Pistone never claimed to have no regrets about what happened to Lefty. The operation was necessary. The prosecutions were justified. But the human cost was real and permanent. In interviews, Pistone sometimes expressed a kind of respect for Lefty's loyalty. Even after being completely betrayed, even facing death from the mob and imprisonment from the government, Lefty kept omerta. He didn't cooperate. He didn't testify. He didn't try to mitigate his punishment by providing information. His loyalty was absolute, even when loyalty no longer served any purpose except his own sense of honor. That loyalty, Pistone suggested, was both Lefty's greatest strength and his ultimate weakness. It made him trustworthy, reliable, and honorable by mob standards. But it also made him vulnerable to manipulation, unable to recognize when his loyalty was being exploited, unable to protect himself from those who didn't share his values. The broader impact of Operation Donnie Brasco on organized crime was significant. The operation demonstrated that the mob wasn't invulnerable, that their security measures could be penetrated, that their most trusted members could be deceived. The paranoia that already existed in mob culture intensified dramatically. After Donnie Brasco, every crime family became more suspicious of new associates. Background checks became more thorough. The process of bringing someone into family operations became longer and more cautious. Some families even avoided recruiting new members for years, preferring to work with existing personnel whose loyalty was proven rather than risk another infiltration. This defensive posture, while protecting against undercover agents, also limited the mob's ability to expand and adapt. Younger generations were harder to recruit. New operations were harder to launch. The organization became more insular, more conservative, less dynamic. The FBI's success didn't just result in arrests and prosecutions. It fundamentally changed how the mob operated, making them less effective and more vulnerable to other forms of law enforcement pressure. The Bonanno crime family specifically never fully recovered from the damage. They were mocked by other families, their reputation destroyed, their operations compromised. Internal conflicts and additional law enforcement successes further weakened them. They survived, but as a shadow of their former power. And at the center of this historical transformation was Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a foot soldier who never wanted fame or infamy. He just wanted respect, recognition, and to finally become a made man after 26 years of loyal service. He never got what he wanted. Instead, he got betrayed, imprisoned, and died sick and alone. But his legacy, such as it was, exceeded anything he could have imagined. He became a symbol, a case study, a cautionary tale that would be studied, analyzed, and remembered long after his death. The question remains, what should we make of Lefty Ruggiero? How should history judge him? He was undeniably a criminal. He participated in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and likely violent crimes. He chose the mob life knowing full well what it entailed. His suffering doesn't excuse his actions or make his victims less real. But he was also, in his way, a victim not of the FBI specifically, who were doing their jobs and pursuing legitimate law enforcement objectives, but a victim of mob system itself. A system that exploited his loyalty, promised him recognition and belonging, and then betrayed him just as thoroughly as Pistone did, only more slowly and over decades rather than years. He gave the mob 26 years of loyal service and received almost nothing in return. No advancement, no security, no recognition, just grinding poverty, constant pressure to earn, and the perpetual fear of violence or arrest. The mob used him just as completely as the FBI did. They just did it more gradually, and with his complicit acceptance. Perhaps the real tragedy of Lefty Ruggiero wasn't that he was betrayed by Donnie Brasco. Perhaps the real tragedy was that he spent his entire adult life devoted to an organization that never valued him, chasing recognition that was never going to come, believing in a code of honor that only he was actually following. His loyalty was real. His adherence to omerta was genuine. His commitment to the mob's values was absolute. But the organization he was loyal to didn't reciprocate that loyalty. They used him, passed him over, and when he failed, they were ready to kill him without hesitation. Only his continued loyalty, his refusal to cooperate, even when cooperation would have saved him, prevented his execution. And that says something profound about the mob's values. They didn't spare him out of compassion or appreciation for his decades of service. They spared him only because he continued to follow the rules, even when those rules no longer benefited him in any way. This is the complexity of Lefty Ruggiero's legacy. He was simultaneously criminal and victim, betrayer and betrayed, loyal and foolish, sympathetic and responsible. His story resists simple moral judgments because it exists in the gray areas where human weakness, institutional exploitation, and tragic choices intersect. As we come to the end of this story, as we watch Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero fade into history, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. What drives a man to spend 26 years of his life devoted to an organization that gives him so little in return? What makes loyalty persist even when it's clearly not reciprocated? What makes someone keep faith with a system that has failed them repeatedly? For Lefty, the answers lay in his fundamental need for belonging, for respect, for mattering in a world that otherwise would have rendered him invisible. He came from Hell's Kitchen, from poverty, from a world where most men like him would live and die in obscurity, lives unmarked and unremarked. The mob offered him something different. Not wealth or power, at least not for someone at his level, but identity, purpose, a sense of being part of something larger than himself. The code of La Cosa Nostra, the tradition stretching back centuries to Sicily, the brotherhood of made men and soldiers, all of it promised meaning and belonging. That he never fully received what was promised didn't diminish his commitment to it. If anything, it intensified it. He was like a faithful believer whose faith persists despite the absence of miracles, whose commitment deepens precisely because it costs so much. This quality made him vulnerable to exploitation. Both the mob and the FBI used his need for belonging against him. The mob kept him working, earning, risking his freedom and life, always dangling the promise of advancement just out of reach. The FBI, through Pistone, gave him the validation he craved, the respect and recognition he deserved precisely to manipulate him into revealing family secrets. His greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. His loyalty made him valuable, but also exploitable. His trust made him a good friend, but also an easy mark. His need for connection made him human, but also vulnerable. The friendship between Lefty and Donnie Brasco, or rather, between Lefty and Joseph Pistone's performance as Donnie Brasco, was real in some sense, even if it was built on deception. The emotions Lefty felt were genuine. The mentorship he provided was sincere. The care he showed for Donnie's well-being was authentic. That these genuine emotions and sincere actions were directed at someone who is deceiving him doesn't make them less real. It makes them tragic. Lefty was being his authentic self, opening his heart and his world to someone he trusted, and that authentic vulnerability was being weaponized against him. Can we blame him for being fooled? The FBI had invested enormous resources in creating a perfect cover identity for Peastone. They had trained him extensively, supported his operation with elaborate staging and backup, maintained his cover through years of continuous operation. Peastone was a skilled actor and investigator who devoted himself completely to the role. The operation succeeded precisely because it was so well executed, so thoroughly planned, so carefully maintained. Lefty wasn't stupid or careless. He was up against one of the most sophisticated undercover operations in law enforcement history. The fact that he was deceived says more about the FBI's skill than about his lack of judgment. But there's another dimension to consider. Would a more suspicious, more paranoid, less loyal mobster have been fooled? Possibly not. Someone who trusted no one, who questioned everything, who kept everyone at arm's length, might have noticed inconsistencies or refused to vouch for someone without exhaustive verification. But such a person would also have been fundamentally different from Lefty. They would have been harder, colder, more calculating. They wouldn't have been the kind of person who could form genuine friendships or mentor younger criminals with sincere care. They would have been safer, but also more monstrous. Lefty's humanity, his capacity for friendship and loyalty made him vulnerable. To protect himself completely, he would have had to become someone else entirely, someone less human and more purely predatory. The price of the life, as the mob calls it, is paid in many currencies. Lefty paid in his freedom when he went to prison. He paid in his health as cancer consumed him. He paid in his relationships as his family distanced themselves. He paid in his reputation as his name became synonymous with being fooled. But perhaps the highest price was paid in the betrayal itself. The destruction of trust, the revelation that the person you cared most about was an illusion. The knowledge that you had been completely deceived for years. That kind of betrayal doesn't just hurt. It fundamentally changes how you see the world and your place in it. After Donnie Brasco, how could Lefty trust anyone? How could he believe in friendship, in loyalty, in human connection? If the person he had trusted most completely was an FBI agent systematically documenting his every word and action, then how could he ever trust again? This emotional devastation was probably worse than a prison sentence. Prison ends. Bodies heal or don't. But the destruction of your ability to trust, to connect, to believe in the authenticity of human relationships, that damage is permanent. The American mob's decline, which accelerated after Operation Donnie Brasco, can be traced partially to this destruction of trust. The organization was always built on personal relationships, on bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that transcended mere business arrangements. But once those relationships could be revealed as potential deceptions, once any associate might be an undercover agent, the foundation of mob culture began to crumble. Lefty's unwitting contribution to this decline was significant. His openness with Peastone revealed not just criminal activities, but the emotional and cultural underpinnings of mob life. He showed the FBI that mobsters weren't mythological figures or movie characters. They were humans with the same needs, fears, and vulnerabilities as anyone else, and humans can be manipulated. The FBI learned this lesson well and applied it in subsequent operations. Undercover agents were trained to build genuine rapport, to understand and exploit the emotional needs of their targets, to become the friend or mentor or ally that the target needed. Operation Donnie Brasco established the template for how to infiltrate criminal organizations by understanding and manipulating human psychology. Again, Lefty was the teacher, though he never wanted or intended that role. His place in history is secure, though not in the way he hoped. He wanted to be remembered as a respected made man, a loyal soldier who finally received his recognition. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale, as the man who was fooled, as a supporting character in someone else's story of triumph. But perhaps there's a more charitable way to remember him, as a man whose loyalty exceeded his judgment, as someone who genuinely cared about others, even in a world built on violence and exploitation, as a person who kept his code even when it cost him everything, as a human being who made terrible choices, but remained somehow fundamentally human throughout. He participated in crimes. He caused harm. He chose the mob life with full knowledge of what it entailed. None of that can be excused or forgotten. His victims, whoever and wherever they were, deserve to be remembered too. But we can acknowledge his humanity while condemning his actions. We can understand his motivations while rejecting his choices. We can see him as a complete person, criminal and victim, loyal and foolish, sympathetic and responsible, all at once. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero rolled the dice left-handed for 26 years, hoping that eventually his luck would change, his loyalty would be rewarded, his life would finally mean something. And in the end, just as the house always wins in gambling, the system always wins in the mob. His loyalty earned him nothing but betrayal. His service earned him nothing but prison and death. But he kept the code. He maintained omerta. He died as he lived loyal to the end. Even when loyalty no longer served any purpose except his own sense of honor. Whether that makes him a tragic hero or a cautionary fool is for you to decide. History offers both interpretations, and perhaps both are true simultaneously. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Lefty Ruggiero, that people are complex, that choices have consequences, that loyalty is valuable but can be exploited, and that the systems we devote ourselves to often don't deserve our devotion. He wanted to be made. He wanted to matter. He wanted respect. He wanted to belong. He got none of it. But somehow, decades after his death, we're still talking about him, still trying to understand him, still grappling with the complexity of his story. Maybe that's the only immortality any of us get. Not the legacy we hoped for, but the legacy we earned through the choices we made and the life we lived. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero earned his place in history, just not the place he wanted. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero's story reminds us that in the underworld, loyalty is currency, and trust is the most dangerous gamble of all. He rolled the dice left-handed for 26 years, hoping that eventually he'd hit the jackpot, that his dedication would be rewarded, that he'd finally become somebody in the world he had chosen. Instead, he became infamous, a cautionary tale, a supporting character in someone else's triumph, the man who was fooled by the FBI's greatest undercover agent. But he was also more than that. He was a human being, complex and flawed, whose story reveals uncomfortable truths about loyalty, belonging, and the systems we devote our lives to. His tragedy wasn't just that he was betrayed. His tragedy was that he spent decades chasing recognition from an organization that was never going to give it to him, believing in a code fakely he was truly following. The house always wins in gambling, in the mob, in life. The house always wins. Lefty understood this intellectually, but he kept playing anyway, kept betting on loyalty and honor, and the hope that tomorrow would be different from today. It never was. If this story kept you company tonight, if it made you think, if it helped you pass the quiet hours, show some love with a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the most fascinating stories from the criminal underworld. These aren't just crime stories. They're human stories, complicated and tragic, and revealing about the choices people make and the consequences they face. What gangster story should I cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. There are so many stories to tell, So many lies that intersected with history in unexpected ways. So many lessons to be learned from the choices people made and the prices they paid. And remember, wherever you're watching from, whether it's New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, whether it's London or Tokyo or Sydney, whether it's midnight or 3 o'clock in the morning, or some other quiet hour when the world sleeps and you're still awake, these stories are here to keep you company through the darkness. Benjamin Ruggiero died on November 24, 1994, at age 68, his body destroyed by cancer, his reputation destroyed by betrayal, his dreams destroyed by the very loyalty that defined him. He's buried quietly, without fanfare, another casualty of the life he chose. But his story lives on in films and books, in FBI training sessions and academic studies, in conversations like this one where we try to understand what his life meant and what lessons it offers. Maybe the lesson is that loyalty without wisdom is dangerous, or that belonging isn't worth any price, or that the systems we serve often don't serve us in return, or that trust, that beautiful, necessary human quality, makes us vulnerable to those who would exploit it. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Be careful who you vouch for. In the mob and in life. When you put your reputation on the line for someone else, when you stake your credibility and your trust on another person's character, you're gambling with everything you have. Lefty gambled and lost. He rolled the dice left-handed one last time, and the FBI won. Sweet dreams. Wherever you are, I'll see you in the next one.